Okay, so first thing, can everyone hear me? Okay, I'm going to endeavor to speak as slowly as possible. This is very hard for me to do, for anyone who's actually met me, but I'm gonna do this. First of all, thank you so much to all the sponsors tonight, to the Wiener Library, to the University of Huddersfield, the Holocaust Education and Learning Center, and it's a great honor to be here to help open or to commemorate the Holocaust during Holocaust Memorial Week, if you will, but also to commemorate the coming collaboration between all of the organizations I just mentioned. It's also an even greater honor to be in the presence of survivors who thank you again for always reminding me of the meaning of what we do and why it's important, and for your courage in continuing to testify and to tell your story, which must certainly be a difficult task to do. I should probably also start by saying, in one of those bizarre historical coincidences of which when you do history you find more and more and more, my wife's family, who is Polish, originally from Krakow, her great-grandfather died in Auschwitz. He had a number 3,000, which is quite low. And she had her grandfather and two great uncles are survivors of Auschwitz. And one of them, named Teofil Modelski, and we know this because my wife is looking at getting Polish citizenship, Teofil Modelski ended up here in Huddersfield. And we actually have his immigration documents that we got through the ITS that brought him here with his wife. And we just went through those several weeks ago. So the world is a very, very small place. And so that gives me another wonderful reason to be here, and we'll be coming back shortly, I hope, to explore that family connection. I'm really excited, excited may be the wrong word. I'm emboldened to speak tonight about this particular topic because unfortunately, things like fascism, anti-Semitism, prejudice, hatred are unfortunately, I think, on the rise in the world today, certainly in my world. Being certainly an American is part of this, and I'm from the South in the US, and unfortunately these sorts of things are now becoming even more prevalent. And unfortunately also it dovetails with what I'm going to talk about tonight. And so I want to start, before I get into the myth and before I get into the history, with a little bit of where this is hitting me. Before I came, let's see this now. Before I came, whoop, too many. There we go. One more. Before I moved here, and I just moved here in August, I taught at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And in 2017, the Nazis and other unsavory folks came to Charlottesville in the Unite the Right rally of white nationalists, white supremacists, etc. And I saw this. This came down my street that I live on. And I can tell you that it is not fun when your research topic comes to visit you, and particularly when there are these kinds of people. And the most significant, of course, event in this traumatic period was the murder of one of the servers at our favorite restaurant in Charlottesville, when one of these white nationalists decided to drive his car into a crowd of counter-protesters. And that gives, I think, a little more weight and significance to what I'm going to talk about tonight, the history as well as the present. And so if you look at some of this, you'll notice already that these are very much both Nazi symbols and in many ways Wehrmacht symbols that have been appropriated by modern day Nazis. I don't call them neo-Nazis because there's nothing really different about them except the time period. And they too are adopting, this is the German eagle that you see in German memorabilia and the German army. And so there's also a connection here. I just want to kind of begin with that because I think that the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, which I've tried to destroy as much as possible in my work, has a really bizarre ability to persist in popular culture. This is sort of part of it, but even in a more problematic and perhaps subtle way, it's something that is still with us. And it's always surprising to me how many people in the general public don't understand what a compromised and criminal organization the Wehrmacht was. And so I want to just really briefly show some examples of this that you may or may not have been aware of. One of them, this is from a Facebook group, but one of them is the, I think, ever more popular practice of World War II reenacting, in which people are dressing up like not only the German army, but very often either the SS or the Waffen-SS. And here you have a photo from one of these reenactments, and you'll notice that this guy has what very much appears to be some form of white supremacist / neo-Nazi tattoo. And these are, of course, public events. People go to these events to ostensibly learn about the past, and it's obviously problematic when people like this are representing history. Another example from 2010 in the United States. This guy was a candidate for Congress. He didn't win. He was a Republican candidate, and he is also a Civil War reenactor, in this case, a World War II reenactor, and a member of the SS Viking Division, which also is a criminal and genocidal organization. Another example, this one from Germany. This magazine, Der Lanzer, is essentially a Wehrmacht fan publication, and it was published from 1960 almost until 2013. There's an asterisk on there because it just changed the name and is still sort of, or was very up until very recently, still published. And it's sort of another glorification of the Wehrmacht, glorification of the fighting, what I sometimes refer to as Wehrmacht porn. Just people that want to read about battles and things like this without understanding the context of them. And just by nature of comparison, I've added Die Wehrmacht, which was actually a Nazi publication during the war. And if you just kind of look at even just the layout of these two publications, it's quite a troubling thing. Our now current president, during his campaign, published this image. And if you look, this is actually a stock photo of Wehrmacht reenactors that he has mistaken for, I guess, American soldiers. I don't know. Again, deeply problematic. One of the areas that I also think is important, and I always like to push back on this, is the area of video games. And so here we have a video game for Xbox, a first-person shooter is the genre, where now you can take a German perspective, with the caveat that you're not a Nazi, that you're a German soldier, but you're not a Nazi, and you're supposed to question the German role in the war of the normal, ordinary soldier, which I think is probably a reach for most kids playing video games. But it to me is a great example of the normalization of this idea that the Wehrmacht is something that is at best sort of a neutral organization. Of course, we have the same thing over here. This person, Taki, who is a conservative columnist, and in the Spectator last year, he wrote a whole thing on D-Day, where he basically is sympathizing with how bad the Wehrmacht had it at Normandy. Also deeply problematic. And then lastly, we have one of these folks in the US, Brett Stevens. He writes for the New York Times. He's all kinds of problematic, but this is just one example. In an editorial about Soleimani, he writes that think of him as a worthy adversary, and then he compares him to Rommel, as if Rommel is a worthy adversary, some kind of chivalrous sort of all soldiers together sort of thing, which is actually quite common and also deeply problematic. There was, you may know, an Einsatz group in North Africa that was tasked to eventually go with Rommel's soldiers and murder the Jews of North Africa. And the only thing that prevented that from happening was the course of the war. And Rommel, doesn't seem to have ever objected to this, among other things. So I wanted to start with this to give you sort of a present perspective on where we are with this sort of fight against the clean Wehrmacht. Before I move into the second part of my presentation, which is the history. And I want to start with this quote from Rahil Berg, who is one of the great Holocaust historians. And it really summarizes better than I ever could my approach to doing history in general, but also doing the history of the Holocaust. And he says, in my work, I have never begun by asking the big questions, because I was always afraid that I would come up with small answers. And he goes on to sort of talk more about this. But basically his argument is that the best way to try to understand history is to start by looking at really what people did and what happened and what people experienced before we start making larger generalizations and characterizations of history. And so when I was writing Marching into Darkness, that was my approach. There was a lot of talk, and has been, of the German army's complicity in the Holocaust, which is fine, but I wanted to know, what does that look like? What does that mean? What choices were people making? What does complicity look like? Because I felt that complicity, in a certain sense, is a sterile, sanitized term for what actually took place. And I wanted to look at the German army as a criminal organization, because it is, and it was. So as I move forward, I'm going to start with ironically, a bigger picture of the history of the German army, and then I'm going to give you some examples from my research of what the German army actually did, and then I'm going to close by talking a little bit about the development of the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, which essentially says that the German army was a conventional military force, just like any other, and fought a generally law-abiding war against the Red Army predominantly, as well as against the Allies, and had nothing to do with the Holocaust, and nothing to do with the Nazis, and nothing to do with the Third Reich. This is the myth. So the first thing that you have to understand is that the war in general, but specifically the war in the Soviet Union, was to be a war of annihilation. These are the Germans' words. These are the Nazis' words. This is a war where there would be no armistice. There would be no settlement. This was a clash of cultures, and I'm using the words of the Nazis. This is, in their view, this is a clash of cultures, a clash of races, a clash of civilizations, and a clash of ideologies. And it is a zero-sum game. Either one side secures a complete and total victory, or it's destroyed. And this is, in the end, Hitler's viewpoint on the war in general. But it's important because the war in the Soviet Union is essentially, in many ways, the Second World War, or certainly the heart of it, just based on numbers. It's also very important for the Wehrmacht. 17 million Germans served in the Wehrmacht in some way, shape, or form over the course of the war. And if we're talking about the Wehrmacht as army, which I generally am, most of them had at least some experience fighting on the Eastern Front before they went into the West. So it is a defining environment for the German army and for those with experience in the German army. It's also important to point out, and the war in the Soviet Union, I think, does this best, that the Second World War, and in particular the war in the East, was not seen by the Nazis as a separate event from the Holocaust. These things were always intertwined. It's only in the post-war period that they became in some way separated, as we have military history of the war, and then we have sort of history of the Holocaust. But for the Nazis, these two things were together. The war against the Jews was part and parcel of the war for Lebensraum in the East, and the larger Nazi genocidal project that envisioned the murder of between 30 and 40 million Slavs in Eastern Europe. They were not separate. So often the idea that people often say, well, could the Germans have won the war if they hadn't devoted so many resources to the Holocaust? Well, this was not a debate that the Nazis had. They didn't see these things as competing. These things were enabling. They were working together. And it's important, I think, that we retake that understanding, that these things are not separate. They were working together the entire time. And I hope to show some of that tonight. Here we have just a propaganda poster. It's anti-communist as well as anti-Semitic with the Star of David. This is drawing on the Judeo-Bolshevik, Judeo-Bolshevist myth that Jews are behind communism, which is for the Nazis was a very effective way to gain support, because sometimes people were much more afraid of the communists than they were of Jews. And so if you can sort of work people in this way, it was effective. Here you have a leaflet that was dropped to try to convince Red Army soldiers to desert. And I'll just point out that behind the soldier, behind the commissar, behind Stalin is the Jew, according to the Nazis, right? And this sort of very easily sums up the viewpoint of the war in the East. We have some really clear and convincing evidence for how the Nazis, both military leadership and Hitler, envisioned the war in the East to go. These are called the criminal orders. There are 3 of them. Don't be alarmed, the next slides do have some text on them, but I'm going to highlight the important points, okay? The first of these was what's known as the commissar order. And the commissar order basically said that any political officer, uniformed political officer, member of the Red Army who was captured should be shot out of hand immediately on capture, or not even captured, right? They are to be finished off. These are all direct quotes from the order. This is, on its face, already a direct violation of all of the laws and conventions of war that Germany had also signed, right? Written down in black and white. You shall commit war crimes, essentially, because these are war crimes. You cannot shoot prisoners. The second order is known as the jurisdiction decree. This order is particularly important because essentially what it says is that for crimes that you might commit, that you might be punished for, court-martialed for, be subject to military justice for elsewhere in Europe, you will not be subject to prosecution or punishment in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union. This is a blank check for criminality and for violence. It tells German soldiers, you can do whatever you want here. The rules don't apply. And this gets back again to the discussion of the war in Eastern Europe as a war of annihilation. This is different than the war on the Western Front. Some people look at the war in the East as this aberration, this super violent, brutal campaign that is somehow, different. I would argue it's the campaign that's in the West that are the aberration. This is how the Nazis fight war. In the West, they're actually atypical. The last order, guidelines for the behavior of the troops. Note that all of these have come out before June 1941, so several months before the actual invasion. This order is particularly important because its goal is to explain to German soldiers why you are fighting this war. And I've highlighted the relevant text here. We're against Bolshevism. It has a corrosive worldview. Its carriers, note the medicalized language that is frequently used to describe Jews as sort of pests, vermin, this kind of thing the Nazis use. One of the other elements, it says this war demands ruthless and aggressive action. We'll see what that looks like in a minute. Against Bolshevik agitators, snipers, saboteurs, and Jews. And if you notice, of those 4 things, 3 of them are behaviors. So you're being categorized by what you do, and you can stop doing that, theoretically. But being Jewish, certainly in the Nazi concept, is a racial genetic characteristic that cannot be changed. So what this order has done is essentially militarized the Jewish population of Eastern Europe as legitimate military targets, simply by the fact of being a Jew, being Jewish. And then lastly, there's this longer part here about the racial inferiority of the Soviet Union, with another jab at the fact that, just so you know, Judaism is strongly represented in the Soviet Union, with all of the implications and assumptions that you can take from that. I'm going to move on from this, but first I want to just note that many times orders in the military sort of stay up at a general level and nobody ever actually reads them. These are intended to and were disseminated down to the individual soldiers. A lieutenant or a sergeant read these out to the lowest levels. So we know that they actually do have an effect, unlike a lot of orders that just sort of drift around in echelons above reality, right? And taken together, even before a single German soldier has stepped foot into the Soviet Union, just imagine what kind of culture and climate this has created in this entire organization. It has already explicitly accepted that the laws of war no longer apply, that you can do whatever you want, that Jews are an enemy. It's linked them with your actual military enemy that you are rightfully afraid of. And this is the mindset that the German army has before it even starts fighting. And I think this is a key point. Another thing that is really important in the development of this dysfunctional criminal organization is the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. And when I first wrote this slide, I put a question mark after it. But then when I finished creating the slide, I took it off. And I'll explain why. The planners, the military planners in the German army, knew that by the method of the tactics they were going to use, that they were going to take large numbers of Soviet prisoners of war. They knew this before even starting. Their plan explicitly was to not have a plan. They did not plan to take care of the prisoners of war, or to do any of the things they're obligated to do under the laws of war, under the Geneva Conventions, under the Hague Conventions. Their plan was basically put them in a large field and we'll figure it out later. Army units at all levels issued orders similar to this one. So this one limits horse flesh as the food that Soviet prisoners of war can eat. Prisoners of war were not authorized to use medical equipment that was confiscated from them. This is a prisoner of war camp at a place called Droege D, just outside of Minsk, that held around 100,000 prisoners of war. And that's it. It is an open field with a barbed wire fence around it. In the heat of the summer, which in Russia is actually quite hot, and the cold of winter. That's it. German Army Colonel's testimony about cannibalism. Now this is obviously bad, but it's worse. And I want to just give you some numbers, so I'm going to refer to my notes very quickly. During World War II, 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war died as a direct result of Nazi policy. Some of them are executed, commissars. Very often Jewish soldiers of the Red Army are separated and executed. And then many of them are dying from conditions that the Nazis themselves have created. Of that 3.3 million, 2 million die in the first 8 months. 2 million people die in 8 months at the hands of the Nazis. That's more than Rwanda, that's more than Bosnia, and it's more than Armenia, and it's almost more than all three of those added together. To give you put a different way, 60% of Soviet prisoners of war die during the war. Compare that to 4%. 4% of Allied prisoners of war held by the Nazis died. In the Pacific theater, 27% of Allied prisoners of war, and that was not a nice place, right? From my perspective as an American, Americans who like to think that we won everything, it's true. This is 8 times American combat casualties in all of World War II, both theaters. 8 times. Which means, if you draw this out, more Soviet prisoners of war died every day during World War II than Allied prisoners of war died during the entire war. So, and I'm not gonna get into definitions, but this is the environment in which, and many more German soldiers had touched on this experience than even they do later on the Holocaust experience. But if you take this as a sort of background, as a set of experiences that people have had, and overlay it with everything we've already talked about, it starts to give you a sense of the kind of mentality and ethos that the German army carries with it into the Soviet Union. Okay. Just a couple more things at the higher level. The German army, after Poland, where a few generals after the invasion of Poland expressed serious discontent with the murder of Polish intelligentsia, Jewish intelligentsia, and others. The Nazis were concerned that this never happened again, so before the invasion of the Soviet Union, they ensured that there was a set agreement in place for how the German army would cooperate with the Einsatzgruppen. And the Einsatzgruppen are the mobile killing squads who are responsible for the deaths by bullets of approximately 2.5 million Jews in the occupied East, most of them before the gas chambers even opened at Auschwitz. And this is the details of the order, which essentially says that the German army is responsible for transportation, supply of bullets, food, etc., and protection for these Einsatzgruppen units, and that the only thing that they're not responsible for is the actual deployment, which Himmler and the SS carry out. So the idea that the German army doesn't know about what's going on is absolutely untrue, because they are coordinating directly with them. Shortly after the occupation of Kiev in Ukraine, a series of bombs go off in the city that are left behind by the Red Army. And one of them kills an entire staff and an artillery general. Very angry about this, the Wehrmacht turns directly to the Einsatzgruppen and suggests a reprisal action against the Jews of Kiev. And that results in the mass execution at Babi Yar of 33,000 Jews, which is the single largest open-air mass shooting of the war, and which the German army assisted in, it guarded, its engineers helped excavate graves, and it was complicit in this. It asked for this, okay? And then just to gloss over a couple more elements, and then I'm going to now come down to the more specific elements. Very often, both in the invasion of Poland in 1939, as well as in the invasion of the Soviet Union, Wehrmacht officers were the first ones to establish ghettos, on their own accord sometimes, in the cities that they encountered, in order to start enacting anti-Jewish policy, so it wasn't always the SS. Another great example at sort of a larger national level is the V2 rocket program, which was quite content to use Jewish slave labor and also the slave labor of other folks to build weapons for the Third Reich, and one could actually expand this out to the entire weapons industry as well. And as I've seen in my research, even at the local levels, every German unit that had access to a supply of Jewish slave labor used it in some way, shape, or form. Whether it was as cleaning people, as janitors, as mechanics, as repair people, as sheer sort of physical labor to create fortifications, etc., they're using Jewish slave labor. So they're definitely involved in that aspect as well. Okay, let's now come down to that level I talked about in the beginning. What does complicity actually look like? I want to start with one unit that I talk about in the book, the 354th Infantry Regiment. It's a second line, so not the best quality, but a regular Army unit. It had originally, when it first got to the Soviet Union, interestingly enough, it provided the guard force at the Droege D camp I just showed you, the Soviet prisoner of war camp, where soldiers from this unit testified that they had witnessed mass shootings. There is at least significant evidence that some of them may have participated in some of these mass shootings, though potentially on a volunteer basis. It's always unclear when you're working with perpetrator documents. The closer you get to actually committing the crime, they're often less reticent to talk about it. They end up in the town of Krupki. Krupki, not to be confused with the multiple Krupkis in Poland and Czechoslovakia, which happened many times when I was doing this research, is about an hour east of Minsk in what is now Belarus. A small town of about 2,000 people, 1,000 of whom are Jews. On a day in September 1941, the commander of an Einsatzkommando, so a subunit of the Einsatzgruppen, shows up at the battalion headquarters, talks to the battalion commander, this guy, Major Valdo, and says, I'm going to come here and I'm going to murder all the Jews in this village, and I need your help because I only have 18 people and I don't have the manpower to handle that large number of potential victims. So perhaps surprisingly, the commander says okay. An army lieutenant attached to the headquarters is the person who rides out on a horse and searches around and chooses the execution site. No SS involved, Wehrmacht only. He goes out, he looks for the best possible spot, which is here. I visited there in 2009, and it is a marshy area with a sort of dry creek bed that was chosen. That's what he chose. A couple days later, the SS show up, the Einsatzgruppen shows up. German army soldiers are involved in every aspect of the operation. They are dragging Jewish people from their houses. Sometimes they are shooting those that are too old or too frail to leave their house. They are guarding them in the marketplace. They are marching them to the killing site, which may sound innocuous, except that that's what's preventing people from escaping. So they are just as, in my book, just as guilty as the shooters in this case. At the killing site, they're guarding them because they divide the Jews up when they get to the open air killing site, and they then take them in smaller groups. And when the Einsatzgruppen starts to run low on bullets, which it does, the Einsatzgruppen commander turns to the German commander and says, I need people and bullets. And the German army supplies a platoon of soldiers who participate in the shooting. And as a result, basically the entire population of Krupki, around 1,000 people, are killed in one day by this one unit and the Einsatzgruppen that are attached to it. And so even there you see an incredible degree of cooperation in the Holocaust, and in a very important aspect of the Holocaust. One of the things, or the themes that I sort of picked up is an escalation over time, at least in the Soviet Union. And one of the key aspects in this, and something that I think I discovered in a way that I hadn't thought that I would, is the role of the anti-partisan war in the mobilization of the German army for genocide, for the Holocaust. Before I say anything else, I should start by saying, at the time that I'm discussing here, there is no anti-partisan war, because there are no partisans. Because Stalin killed anybody that knew how to be an insurgent in the 30s, because he didn't want them to be used against him. So while the Russians have historically been great at being guerrillas, all the way back to the Cossacks and Napoleon, Stalin got rid of the subject matter experts in this particular way of fighting. Couple that with the fact that the Nazis reached Minsk in 2 weeks, which is an incredibly short amount of time, and it leaves the Russians with basically no time to even set up any kind of behind-the-lines activity. So the kinds of things that you see in movies like Defiance, or the German soldiers being harried in the snow by Russian partisans, is not really a thing until late 1942, when the Soviets have sort of caught up and are really starting to do this kind of sort of activity. So that's the foundation for this piece. In late September 1941, there is a conference at a place called Mogilev, which is also in Belarus. And the purpose of the conference is to share lessons learned about how do we fight the partisans. Remember, there are no partisans, really. The invitees to this conference are almost entirely German army officers. And most of them are quite low-ranking, from lieutenant to colonel-ish. But they're invited because they've had experience in anti-partisan warfare, which begs the question, what are they actually doing when there really isn't an anti-partisan war? And the answer is they've been killing Jews. And so one of the groups of people that come here are from the 354th Infantry Regiment, who about a week earlier carried out the mass execution in Krupki. What do they do at this conference? Well, they have these sort of breakout sessions where they exchange lessons learned on tactics of surrounding villages and how do you do this, that, another thing. They hear from this guy, Arthur Nebe. Arthur Nebe at the time was the commander of Einsatzgruppen B, which was responsible for the murder of several 100,000 Jews in Belarus, which was ongoing at the time. We know what happened, at least what was planned to happen here, because we have the agenda. The agenda survived and is in the archives in Germany. And you can read what the daily events were going to be. One of them was a briefing by Nebe to everyone at the conference, and that we only know the title. We don't have a transcript or minutes, but the title of it was The Anti-Partisan War with Particular Regard to the Jewish Question. Now, we all know the Jewish question in the Nazis' mind was, how do we get rid of the Jews? And the final solution, the full title of that, is The Final Solution to the Jewish Question. So, put on your detective hat for a minute. You have an SS commander of a killing squad who is currently murdering Jews, men, women, and children in the Soviet Union, giving a talk to German army officers, and the subject of that talk is the anti-partisan war with particular regard to the Jewish question. I don't think it's a stretch to suggest that that conversation had a lot to do with killing Jews and not a whole lot to do with partisans. But we'll take that as conjecture at this point. And then I'll come to that in a second. The other thing they do is they go on a sample operation. So imagine all these army officers. They go out and they actually watch a sort of textbook anti-partisan operation that's carried out by an SS police unit. Already that should send off warning signs. This unit surrounds a village. It goes into the village. It sweeps the village for partisans. It doesn't find any. It does find, I think it's 18 Jewish men and 7 Jewish women. And it executes them. And this is all from the report. It's in the archive. It says it's exactly this. No partisans could be found, however, we executed 20-some Jews. And the message here is pretty clear. The message is Jews are part of this anti-partisan war, and if you can't find partisans, killing Jews is the next best thing to do. And this is the message that all these people take away to all of the units in Belarus, in the rear area in Belarus. A couple weeks after that, this executive summary comes out, which is a description of sort of the takeaway from this conference, which is that soldiers must act ruthlessly and mercilessly without any personal surge of emotion. And I'm not going to dwell too much on this, except to say, having been in the army, having been in combat before, you never have to tell a soldier not to feel bad about shooting at someone that's shooting back at them. I mean, it's almost second nature or instinctual. I mean, that's how war is. That's what war is. So if you have to publish a memorandum like this, what are you talking about? Why would a soldier have personal emotion that would prevent him from doing his job if he's fighting against another Red Army soldier? Probably because these people are being asked to kill women and children, and that is traumatic for them. And so this idea of being ruthless, making hard decisions on suspicious persons, which is always code in many ways for Jews, requires an additional level of motivation and indoctrination to do. One of the things that you learn is that you never write a memo unless something actually happened to cause that memo, right? Think about all the product warnings you see on foods or on chemicals or on Tide Pods. Don't eat Tide Pods. Well, that's because somebody did it, right? That's how we should see this particular order as well. Okay, I'm going to move on to something that rarely ever happens for historians, but when it does, we are so happy. And that's the smoking gun. We never find the smoking gun. It rarely ever happens. I went through all of the reports from this particular division, which is the 354th Infantry Regiment's division. So this is their boss. They're in this unit. And they're pretty much the only fighting organization in this division. I went through all of their reports of killed, captured, engagements, operations, combat, etc. And I noted down the numbers. And then I plotted it on a graph. And this is cumulative over time. So here's the conference in late September. Here's when the executive summary comes out. And then look what happens to the numbers of people who are captured in the next 2 months. It goes from 2,000 roughly to around 8,000. And this curve is only lower because of the scale of the graph, right? So what you can see here is that literally after the conference, the number of people being captured and killed goes up exponentially. What's the explanation for this? In my book, it has to be that they're changing what they're doing in accordance with what they've been told to do at this conference. I should also point out that being captured is more or less akin to being murdered as well, because most of these people end up being killed in some way, shape, or form later, after they're handed over by the German army to someone else. So we can probably count most of these people as also having been killed. Okay. I want to talk quickly about another unit. This is a battalion that received the order to murder all the Jews in its area. After the war, one of the lieutenants involved here, this guy, Sibyl, testified in a letter to the German court that this order to murder all the Jews came because an officer had returned from a conference in Mogilev where he was told that where there's a Jew, there's a partisan, where there's a partisan, there's a Jew, and to murder Jews. So again, that's a pretty good smoking gun as well. In this particular unit, 3 companies, infantrymen, they all receive the same order. The first guy is a dedicated Nazi. He says, sure, no question, he murders the Jews in his area of responsibility. The second guy, this guy, Noel, hems and haws about it. He's not sure. He's kind of a weak leader. He requests the order in writing. He gets it in writing, and they carry it out. However, this man, the man that wrote the letter, Lieutenant Sibyl, refused. He said, nope, I'm not going to do it. And the battalion commander said, yes, you will. And he said, no, I'm not. You can't make me do this. And nothing happened to him, except that he was, you can imagine the words that he was called by his commander. But he refused to do it. He said, this is not something that the German army does. We don't murder civilians, and I'm not going to do it. And he didn't. Okay, I'm just going to talk about a little bit of the escalation here, and then I'm going to move in to the last part of my comments. This is the town of Slonim in Belarus. It used to be eastern Poland before 1939. I always like this picture because it's a little bit of the more things change, the more they stay the same. So here's the German Army headquarters in the town in the same building that the current police station occupies. In the town of Slonim, we see an escalation in participation. So the German Army unit there assisted in the murder of around 10,000 Jews in one day in November of 1941. And I can talk more about that perhaps in the questions and answers. But you start to see a lot of different ways of collaboration and complicity, some of which I'll mention. This is interesting. We talk about sort of the life trajectories of German units. So one of the German units that had been involved in the atrocities that I've talked about earlier ended up fighting in this operation. This is called Operation Dreieck Viereck, which is just Operation Triangle Square. And the purpose of it is not important. It's an anti-partisan sweep. You can see they're sort of sweeping and moving. What's interesting are these things that came up in the documents. This is from the after-action report of one of the units. And just the key point here is that they were proceeding in an area that was heavily mined, and they had 4 of these Minesweeper 42s that were blown up instead of the German soldiers. Right? So they were using these Minesweeper 42s to clear mines out of the way of the advancing soldiers. If you go back a month, or a little bit less than a month, you have the guidance in preparation for this operation. And in preparation for the operation, the German army says, round up Jews and other people, give them shovels and hoes and rollers, and we're going to call them Minesweeper 42s. So they were forced to walk in front of the German army units and clear mines by hand. So when this document says that 4 Minesweeper 42s were blown up, they're talking about Jews or potentially other people that were prisoners of the German army. So we're sort of reaching a climax of participation here. I mean, this is pretty deeply complicit. The last part that I want to cover in this area, before I begin to close, is an area that I discovered in my research that is it's deeply uncomfortable. For a lot of the history of the Holocaust, it's been a taboo. It's been something that hasn't been talked about. Often survivors don't talk about it either, and it's sexual violence. I discovered a lot of sexual violence against Jews carried out by the German army. And it's interesting the way it comes up. One German soldier in an interrogation after the war, the German policemen were asking him about this killing he participated in, and he's telling the story, and he says, before the roundup, I went into the ghetto to check on my Jewish girlfriend, Ida. She was okay, and then I went on to participate in this killing. And this is one of those moments where, as an historian, you want to reach back through the past and grab this detective by the neck and say, please follow up on this. But they're not interested in that. They're interested in the killing, so they don't. So I don't know what that means. My guess is, with about 90% certainty, that she was not his girlfriend in any of the senses that we might consider. However, I did come across a very interesting testimony by a German soldier who talked about having had 2 girlfriends who lived with him in his house in Slonim, one of which eventually was a cleaning lady, but I think it's pretty obvious what the relationship was. And he talked about the fact that he had this Jewish woman living with him. And then, in something that again only happens when you're very fortunate, so maybe this is my last good book, I found a testimony from a Jewish survivor from Slonim, a guy by the name of Abraham Orlinsky. Abraham Orlinsky and his wife shared the other half of the house with this German soldier that had the Jewish girlfriend. His wife had been a doctor. She was somewhat privileged in the society, so they were allowed to live in their house for a certain period of time. So he's living with, this guy has the room upstairs, and he's living with the same guy. And he tells in his testimony that this man who had this Jewish woman living with him and essentially was an instrumental sexual violence victim. It doesn't appear that she was sort of violently coerced, but she was clearly coerced into doing this. It was not her choice. It was non-consensual. The soldier, a guy named Eichinger comes back from the killing site in Slonim, that 10,000, and he's drunk. And he sits down at the kitchen table with Abraham Orlinsky and tells him that his girlfriend had been taken to the killing site, and he tried to save her, but she asked that he save her mother as well, and he couldn't do that. So he had watched her be executed. And I just want to pause and let that sink in for a second. If you can just imagine that moment where a Jewish citizen of Slonim is sitting at a table with his housemate, who is a German soldier, who has just told him that the woman that is also living with them has been murdered, and is in some weird way asking him to kind of sympathize. And in Orlinsky's testimony, he's just like, what am I supposed to do here? I'm not at all sympathetic. And basically he said he didn't say anything. He just listened to Eichinger talk about this. It's not the only evidence of this. I've had other people, other German soldiers talking about their commanders having had Jewish girlfriends. And it seems to have been a relatively common occurrence. And it's just another thing to add to the ledger of criminality of the German army. And again, what do we see when we look on the ground at what people are actually doing? These kinds of things. So complicity takes on a much different tone when we know things like this. Okay? All right, last thing before I begin to close. I promise I'm doing that. I do want to talk about one moment that is really important, not because it excuses anything else, but for precisely the opposite reason. It's a story of a man named Joachim Lochbihler. Lochbihler was a German soldier. Before the war, he'd been a brewer in Munich. In Belarus, the German army opened up several breweries to provide beer for the soldiers, and they had no idea how to run them. So they basically put out a call for people that know how to run breweries. And so Lochbihler and one of his friends get this good job, I think, of running a brewery in the town of Lida. It was called the Pupko Brewery. The Pupkos were a Jewish family in Lida. The history of Jews in alcohol industry in Eastern Europe goes on a long way, but they'd basically been running this brewery for a very long time. And this is a painting of it in 1916, ironically with a German soldier in it. And because the Germans, other than these two guys, don't know how to run a brewery, they let the Pupkos stay on to help manage it, because it's apparently a big brewery. And so, they're allowed some Jewish labor to help run it. I find Lochbihler's statement that he gives to the police in the 60s, where he says that during the roundup, during the extermination action in Lida, which is very close by to Slonim, it's in the same area, he and his unnamed colleague put on their helmets and grabbed their rifles and stood outside of the brewery. And when the SS came by, they said, this is an important German army operation, and you can't come in because you would disrupt, apparently, the supply of beer, which was important. Now, when I read this, at that point, I was pretty cynical. And I thought, right, this is just what a German soldier being investigated for war crimes would say, right? Of course you're going to say this. And I kind of thought, okay, I mean, I might put it in the book, but it's probably wrong. He's probably lying about it. And I'm going through the USC Shoah Foundation oral histories, and I come across Pupko. One of the Pupko folks from Lida had emigrated to Mexico, so this was in Spanish, so I had to find someone that spoke Spanish to actually tell me what she said. She was from the Pupko family, and she had lived in the brewery. And she mentioned Lochbihler by name and said that after the war she corresponded with him and that her father had written him basically a get-out-of-jail letter saying that he had saved them. And as time went on, I found other people, like the Stoll family, Michael, his sisters, and his father, all of whom were allowed to sleep and live in the ghetto, in the brewery, by Lochbihler. And obviously, these kids are not working in the brewery, right? They testify that Lochbihler let them celebrate the Seder. He helped them get supplies for it. He took in old people and young children that were not working. He hid them. There is some evidence that the Bielski brothers used the brewery as a conduit to get into the ghetto in Lida. And they couldn't have done this without Lochbihler knowing about it. So I think, to my best ability, I think I found someone that's a true rescuer in the German army and a true hero in a lot of ways. And I point that out not because it in any way takes away from the criminality and the evil of the German army, but precisely because it shows that there were people at the time who recognized what was going on was wrong, took action against it to stop it, and got away with it. So it sort of shows that the space existed to resist if you wanted to. You could do it, you could get away with it. And I should probably add something here that many of you may already know, but in all of the investigations after the war, in all the post-war trials, and all the attempts by German defense attorneys who are defending war criminals, we have not yet found any evidence of a single German being executed for refusing to execute a Jew. Zero. And obviously, if a German defense attorney could find this, it's the golden ticket, because it lends weight to all those people who argued, I did it because they were going to shoot me, right? But they don't find that. There are people that get killed because they try to get others to resist and this kind of stuff, but no one is shot for refusing to participate, because that's not how militaries work, that's not how organizations work, and there are lots of reasons which I can talk about in the question and answer period about why the German army doesn't do that. Okay, closing. Where does this myth come from that I talked about several hours ago at the very beginning, right? It starts at Nuremberg. In the Nuremberg trials, the SS is termed a criminal organization. So purely by being a member of the SS in the eyes of the International Military Tribunal, you are a criminal. The Wehrmacht, not. So that's the beginning, right? It starts with that, with definitions. Individual commanders of the Wehrmacht are tried as war criminals, but the organization itself is not. Then we have the Americans and the Brits collaborating to also create this myth. The Americans establish at a former German prisoner of war camp here, this beautiful castle in Königstein, a prisoner of war camp for high-level German generals. And they send in the Army Historical Division, which are army historians. And their job is to go in there, interview these German generals about what it was like to fight the Soviets. Tell us how you did this, because we're looking forward to the Cold War and we're seeing that we might have to fight these people ourselves. So they're interested in learning about how the German army fought on the Eastern Front and blah, 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 and tanks and left, right, flank and all of this kind of thing. And that's what the German generals tell them. And of course they leave out all of the collaboration with the Einsatzgruppen and all of the killing of prisoners of war. And so the American military and these historians get an interesting view of the German military. On the British side, Basil Liddell Hart, who was a renowned historian in many ways of the military, becomes very enamored of German generals, and he visits them frequently at their prisoner of war camp here in England, and he kind of thinks that they're his buddies. And he also begins to write these sort of sanitized histories of the war based on these German generals' descriptions. And lest you think I'm being too hard on him, after the war, in the post-war period, he lobbies very hard for convicted war criminals at Nuremberg, to include Einsatzgruppen commanders and Waffen-SS commanders, to be released from prison. He writes letters and says these guys are being done poorly by and we should let them out. So he's part of this as well. Another part of that are all of these memoirs that come out by German generals, many of which are written in the auspices of being in confinement or being taken to the United States to tell us more about your experience during the war. Just think for a minute about the language here. You have a Nazi general writing a book called Lost Victories, as if we should be upset and sad that they didn't win these victories, right? It's very much lost cause Confederacy in the American South. Von Mellenthin writes a book that was on General Schwarzkopf's desk in the Gulf War. I mean, this is problematic. And then this is an example, and Keitel, by the way, Keitel was convicted as a war criminal, both for the massacre of Allied prisoners of war and also the Ardeatine Caves, massacre of Jews from Rome. And then this is just an example of that Wehrmacht pornography I was telling you about. If you read this thing, it's basically just all of these amazing tank battles and like how amazing the Germans were at fighting tank battles. Which if you just read it, it's like, okay, German army is really cool, I guess. But there's nothing of the context about what kind of organization this is. And so all of these things sort of begin to contribute. Until 1995, when there was a very important exhibition that took place in Germany called the Wehrmacht exhibit. It was very controversial for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to get into right now. But for the very first time in the public sphere, now historians have been doing this, but in the public sphere, it confronted the German public with the crimes of the Wehrmacht, with letters, diary entries, photographs. So here's a guy looking at all of these photographs taken by German soldiers. And it caused a giant uproar in Germany because you had disturbed this myth, this very comfortable myth that everyone was living with. And why was this myth in place and why was it comfortable? Well, 17 million Germans is a lot of fathers, brothers, uncles, sons. So you can say the SS are criminals, but if you start to say the German army is criminal, now you're hitting way too close to home for a lot of people. But this really tore the scab off of that in a lot of ways. And you can see by some of the responses during the exhibit, right? So here you have essentially the German neo-Nazi party, or the extreme right fascist party, marching against the exhibit, glory and honor to the Wehrmacht soldiers. That's a problematic statement. In the back here, you can't read it, but it says, our soldiers were not criminals. Yes, they were, many of them. Certainly as an organization, they were. You also had another example here. It is no crime to protect people and fatherland. So here's the argument that war is hell, and the Soviets fought this very brutal war, and therefore everything the Germans did was justified, right? If you want to get a sense of just how seriously Germany took this, the exhibit, which traveled around Germany and Austria, got bombed in Saarbrücken by Nazis who were so upset, neo-Nazis in this case, who were so upset about it that they literally tried to blow it up. And I think that's where I'm going to end. So thank you so much, and look forward to questions.